Welcome to the Asking Why podcast. I'm your host, Clint Davis. I'm a marriage and family therapist and licensed professional counselor trained in trauma and addiction. The Asking Why podcast is for anyone on a journey of healing and restoration. If you are searching for answers to life's questions and want to learn more about root causes from a psychological and theological mix, this show is for you. In this podcast, myself and a co-host from Clint Davis Counseling and Integrative Wellness will interview guests on a wide range of topics in order to get down to the heart of the problems facing our world and understand why things happen and how to change the world and ourselves for the better. Want to learn more tips and tricks to living a healthy lifestyle? Visit us at Clint Davis Counseling and Integrative Wellness on Facebook and Instagram. If you want to meet our staff or book a speaker, go to clintdaviscounseling.com. Thanks for listening and be sure to subscribe today. All right, Brandi Walker, welcome.
Hello.
The Asking Why podcast, episode 17. I wrote 16, but I realized last week was Sweet 16. So today we're going to be talking about grief, lots of things about grief. For those listening, all of us have experienced grief and loss issues a lot in this last year with COVID and all the things. So we're going to try to get into that. The goal of the podcast today is just to really validate people that are out there listening that have struggled and who have been through loss. And to talk about maybe some do's and don'ts and really just kind of give a really holistic picture of what grief is, what grief is not. Mm-hmm. Because these are, subjects that people don't really talk about in length, they don't really dive into. And yeah, there's a bunch of really good books on grief, but it's a difference between hearing real humans talk about it. And
right.
Yeah.
I agree.
So tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Okay. I'm Brandi Walker. I'm a licensed professional counselor and trained in EMDR. Primarily work with adults, but I do see teenagers from 14 and up, so I have a few teenagers in my caseload as well. Work with a lot of trauma, and I do have a lot of clients that are experiencing grief, and then other things that present anxiety, depression. Haven't dealt with it a lot here, but have a lot of experience with like chronic mental illness. Mm-hmm. And so I do have a couple of clients that kind of fall into that range, but so I can see just about anything, but yeah, I do want to work on not my primary focus, but being more training in grief so that I can serve that population more.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell us a little bit about you, like long term, like how'd you get here? How'd you get into counseling? Like what made you want to become a counselor? And
well, so
you're from Shreveport, right?
I am from Shreveport. Yep. Yes.
That's in Louisiana for those of us that are listening that, are not local.
Yes. So, I don't know if it's personality. Well, it's probably got to be personality, but from a very young age, people just always came to me and told me their secrets and wanted to talk to me. I never had to ask questions. People always just wanted to share their information with me. And I've kind of always been a person that sat back and listened before I talk. And I think that's kind of but I used to sit on my front porch and my friends would come and they would just be telling me stuff. My parents would tell me stuff. So around...
Unfortunately.
Yes. Around high school age, I kind of started thinking about how can I use that, because this is something that just happens
naturally.
Yeah. And I've always kind of been accepting, like it doesn't matter what you come to me and say. I don't have that. I don't react. Yeah. And make people uncomfortable. So
open and non-judgmental.
Yes.
Yeah, it's good.
So I started out thinking I was going to be a psychologist. And by the time I began college, I took the really, really long path and I worked full time and did college all at night. So it took me 10 years to finish all of it. And so by the time I got to the point of doing a master's, I was like, I'm not becoming a psychologist. So I went the counseling route. Yeah. And so, yeah.
Well, and also what you think psychologists do and what, like the general public, even us before becoming clinicians, you don't really know what anybody does.
Absolutely.
So you're like, I want to talk with people and be empathetic. I got to be a psychologist. I need to have a doctorate. You know, I got to do all this stuff. And then you realize like, oh, actually that doesn't help me make any more money. And it doesn't help me like see people anymore. It helps me teach. It helps me do research, but it's actually not necessarily going to help me do this any better.
Right.
Yeah.
So ultimately I pursued my master's in counseling and then from there.
Where'd you go?
Louisiana Tech.
Okay.
Tech Barksdale, actually.
Yeah. Nice.
But yeah, did every bit of it while I worked full time.
Wow.
Getting my master's, I worked for an attorney, and that was an experience.
Oh, I bet.
It's a very difficult job, and then I had to go to school at night.
Yeah.
But that's okay. We got there. And so right out of school, my first job was inpatient psych. And I did not do internships in psych or like that kind of field, so it was a very...
Can you, for those listening out there who don't know what inpatient psych is, can you tell them a little bit about what that is?
Well, that's a lot of chronic mental illness come through inpatient psych, or people who are in psychosis,
Gotcha.
which means their brain is really not functioning right, and their behavior is uncontrollable and
Erratic,
possibly hurtful. Yeah. And so they have to come into a setting that monitors their medication, changes their medication, and is safe for them to not hurt themselves or someone else. So I worked inpatient geriatric psych and adult psych, then moved into inpatient addiction, which was challenging.
Yeah.
But and the challenges there were inpatient, it's like crisis intervention all the time. And so you never get past that to see anyone grow or even take anything that you might be offering, because you're just trying to stabilize them enough to go back out in the world.
Right. Yeah. You're just trying to meet with them so they're not going to kill themselves, kill somebody else. And so you can say, okay, they're okay and can be in society.
Right.
Yeah. I think that's what's so hard as a clinician when you have all this training, especially for you, like as you're saying, you have all this empathy, all this understanding, all this like, tell me your deep secrets. And they're like, talking nonsense or just not capable of doing it.
Right.
And you're just, dealing, managing that and then moving them on.
Right.
It's tough.
Which I will say that taught me a whole lot about how you have to sometimes really, really scale back to the very, very basics of things that a lot of average day-to-day people know. But there are some people that have not had the same experiences or the same education, same backgrounds. And so sometimes you have to take it back to even processes that you have never thought through. How does this happen?
Yeah.
How do we get to this point? Off the top of my head, let's see.
You mean like parents act like this and like systems things? Or that people don't know how to go to the store and buy things,
Yes, like that.
Yeah.
Like those kind of things.
Basic
like totally
need
scaling
type.
it back to,
Yeah.
okay, so...
You don't know how to give yourself a bath properly.
Yes.
Yeah.
That was a lot in inpatient. And I'd never experienced anything
Right.
like that. So it was and I'm not a confrontational person either. So it was very challenging for me to have to sit down with people and say, you have to take a shower.
Yeah.
And this is how often you need to. And this is what you have to do when you're in the shower.
Yeah.
And
It's
just
like things
those
you
basics.
do with kids, right? Yeah. It's like you
Yes.
have to wash here. You can't just leave that.
Yes,
yeah.
but these were in
Grown
inpatient
adults.
addiction. The majority of them were men. I learned really fast how to get over being uncomfortable with certain things.
I bet.
And yeah,
That's hilarious.
yeah. So then after,
And they don't tell you that in grad school.
no, they do not. So after that, I moved on to working in a mental health rehab, where we serviced both clients with private insurance and clients with that are in the Medicaid programs.
Right.
And so there were different avenues that went with that. We serviced a lot of military families in that particular setting. And then that place, unfortunately, closed down unexpectedly.
Or fortunately.
Yes. And I got to move right into this job.
Yeah.
And that was in July of 2019.
I know. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Almost 2 years ago.
That's right. So, and here we are. So.
Absolutely. Well, it's been great to have you. I mean, Jenna was kind of your partner in crime over there, so
Yes.
shout out to her. And y'all both came on staff, and I remember sitting down over at the Word Network on the couch and just talking and looking at vision stuff. And, I just thought you guys were such a good fit. I loved that you were friends and that you had this background. And, it was awesome to see, although it was tragic at the time for y'all, losing your job and not knowing what you're going to do.
Right.
It was a great fit for the Bossier office and moving over into the new office. And, so that was just so cool. And I've loved having you. And I think, I've heard so many awesome things from clients. And, and I say this about all our therapists, not because I'm bragging on you, because it's true. Y'all do some incredible work. So I was super excited about, and one thing you've always talked about is grief and your own story and your own experience. And so, to get to this session on grief, I mean, we all have our own stories. So let's talk, tell your kind of story. Why is grief such an important topic for you? And then I'll go into kind of why it is for me.
Okay. Well, so I've always had a soft spot for grief. And at one time I had briefly entertained the idea of like working in funeral homes. Mm-hmm. And ultimately I chose that I would rather talk with people and help them in life than that part. But, but in, beginning in 2018, myself and my family have gone through, in less than 2 years, we lost 6 family members. And one of those was my fiance. And his death was, this is the part I told you I might get
that's fine.
emotional. His death was sudden and unexpected. And, I mean, he had a massive heart attack, and he was dead within moments on our living room floor. And so that really propelled me into my own journey of grief.
Yeah.
And, of course, up until that point, I had lost other people in my life, but no one that had that kind of impact. Mm-hmm. And so I had to begin my own journey, and I became very up close and personal with figuring out, how do I do this? How do I get through this? And I'm a very hands-on type of person, so I had to have lots of things helping me move through it. Like, I couldn't just sit with it. I had to, like, do. And and, I mean, it's a journey that continues, but I'm in a very, very different place than I was 2 years ago with it. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of what has led me to be passionate about grief.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, I know we've talked about it before, but I know that loss is really heavy and still really heavy. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, what's so hard as counselors is we have our own stuff going on.
Right.
Like, I mean, you were a therapist, you're a counselor,
yes.
and, and that doesn't mean life doesn't happen.
Right. I was off for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And
Back
the first week was planning the funeral. The second week, my best friend lives out of town, and I got on a plane after the funeral and left because I just couldn't be here. Mm. And then I came back, had to go in the house because that's the home I lived in, and right back to work. And the moment I got back to work, the day I got back to work, they began talking about financial problems. And I was propelled into having to figure out finances and make changes. And then, of course, a year later, the place shut down.
Yeah.
So it was...
It's a lot.
A lot.
Right. So that, just speaking of your own story, it's not just a simple, I'm sad because someone's gone. It's all the things that are involved in that. And in your experience, especially, one, it's a different type of grief because it's so sudden and shocking. Mm-hmm. And then two, I mean, there's a lot of trauma within.
Right.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, and that is something that is, it's kind of like there's a couple of types of grief. And all grief experiences aren't traumatic. They're all hurtful, and they all bring pain. But there are times when we are more prepared for it, or it's kind of in the natural course of things that we all expect to happen. And then there are the things that happen that are sudden, and you're not prepared for it. It hasn't really been a thought in your mind, and then all of a sudden, everything in your life is completely different.
Yeah.
And there's not anything you can do about it. So
Yeah, it's tough.
it is tough.
So that kind of propelled you into looking, more at grief and what you want to do with grief. And so talk a little, I mean, if you want to keep using your own story, you can just talk in generalities, but, what are some things that you went through that were helpful? What are some things that people can do when people are going through things that are helpful? And then what are some things that you think would be that weren't helpful?
So for me, I was really very, very fortunate because I worked in an office full of counselors. And my family was absolutely wonderful. I had very few experiences that weren't supportive or good. And I think that's rare. A lot of people,
for sure.
a lot of people are propelled into the position of they either don't have support or the support is not able to meet needs or handle their emotions. But I guess for me, it was very helpful that Jenna specifically, we were in offices right next to each other, but she made a point for an entire year to check on me every weekend because that's when I was alone at home in that house. And that made a huge impact. And, wasn't something I ever asked for, but she had the compassion to do that. Things that were helpful for me were, and this one may sound really strange, but he was the last person that cleaned our house, and I could not clean our house. So, I mean, fortunately, I had the finances. I brought someone in to clean my house. I couldn't touch the things, and that seems very strange, but
well, no, I mean,
I couldn't do it.
That's the trauma, right?
Right.
There are things that in our brains, that bring up that pain and that loss, and we can't tolerate it.
Right. Yeah.
We can't clean, or we can't go back to that place, or we can't drive that car. We can't go by that hospital.
Right.
Because some griefs are very traumatic, like you said.
Yes.
They're not. All grief is, in my opinion, right, like we've talked about before, anything that's not nurturing is traumatic. But how that trauma helps you function, right? Some griefs, if your grandmother's lived 90 years old and you have a great relationship with her and she passes away, it's sad, it's traumatic. No one's supposed to die in our spiritual kind of world. Like, we want to live forever. And so it is like, oh my gosh, you have to deal with death and dying. But there's some closure, there's some expectation, they lived a good life, they had a long journey, they said goodbye, all those things help the trauma symptoms be limited.
Yes.
But in your case, and in, lots of cases of people we work with, car wrecks, illness, heart attack, all these different things, war, suicide.
Right.
The grief is really traumatic to the person left behind. When this was, I think 8 years ago now, my brother-in-law had a glioblastoma, I think is what it was called. It was a prefrontal cancer, and he had been battling it for, I think, since he was like 18, and he had 2 or 3 surgeries. My sister was married to him, and it was just up and down, cancer treatments, recovery, all these different things. And he finally, passed, and he was 26, and we knew it was coming, sort of. It had come back and come out of remission and been really bad. And he had 2 little girls, and our family was just, all around it, dealing with it. It was just chaos. No one really knew what to do.
Right.
No one comes in and tells you what to do.
Right.
We end up getting on hospice and putting them in a hospital bed at their house. And me and my wife don't have kids, so we're kind of taking care of the nieces, and we don't know what to do with the 2 and 3-year-olds, so we're winging it, and it was just chaos. And then you got your family systems issues, so everybody handles it differently and thinks you should do something differently, and everybody's sad and hurting and grieving, and it's a lot.
It is a lot.
And so that wasn't immediate, but because of the type of death it was and because of the type of thing it was, it had all kinds of other problems.
Right. And that's one thing, when someone has a terminal illness, yes, it does give you some time to prepare, and you become definitely closer and more aware to the fact that this person is going to be leaving us.
Yeah.
But there's trauma in watching somebody
Absolutely.
die. I mean, a lot of trauma in that. And, I mean, that's
Yeah, when you're changing their diaper and walking them to the bathroom and they're 26.
Right.
And, 5 months ago you were at Disney World.
Right.
And then 5 months later, that's what's going on. It's a crazy thing to get your brain around.
Right.
You're like, hold on, this is this person I was playing basketball with and laughing with 5 months ago and was in remission.
Right.
And now he thinks the flashlight or the water cup is a flashlight and he can't even function. And then 2 days later, he can't respond and is unresponsive. And then you're sitting with them for 8 hours while they pass. Like, it's a totally different thing.
Right.
None of them are better or worse.
Right.
I think that's the problem with grief, is that we try to measure them or compare them to others. And although books are helpful and this podcast is helpful, like, you have to figure out what it is. You have to do the work to figure out what that grief is for you. Right. And what that means to you and what you believe about God and about loss and about life.
And your faith can be very challenged and tested in those times. But if you walk through that and continue to pursue your own healing and continue on your own journey, a lot of times people come out on the other side with a whole new and different understanding of God and how he can meet you in the midst of those times when there isn't anything anyone can say to make it better.
Yeah, talk about that. So let's talk about how the terrible things people say whenever people are grieving. So what are some things that you've heard from clients, but that you experienced personally?
And again, I didn't experience a lot of people saying the wrong things. Again, I worked in an office full of counselors, and that's where I spent most of my time. But the majority of people get responses and get things said to them like, when it was sudden, like when it's a sudden death, sometimes they get, well, at least you didn't have to watch them die. Yeah. Or if it was...
or if it was, you had to watch them, they're like, at least it wasn't sudden and you weren't surprised.
Right, absolutely. Yeah. That can go vice versa. Or when people lose children, well, you can have another baby.
Ooh, yeah. The whole rainbow baby thing is, it's a lot. And what I mean by that, and just to throw that out there for people listening, is, when you say things like that, it's like you're going to make up for the child you lost. Whether it's a miscarriage or a 4-year-old or 6-year-old or whatever. Right. People... I think if we key in on what the problem is that people want to take your pain away. Yes. People are uncomfortable with pain, and so they want to say something because they love you for the most part that takes your pain away. Right. And unfortunately, what that tells us is that your pain shouldn't be there. Yes. Right. If you're a grieving person, it's like, well, they're in heaven with the Lord, and it's like, okay, that may be true, but I'm not grieving that they're with Jesus. I'm grieving my own pain and my own loss. I'm grieving the laugh that they had, or the thing that we did, or the joke that we told, or the experience of life with them. We're the ones suffering, right? But people want to kind of fix that.
And I'm sitting here trying to think of some others. I had a whole list of them in my mind earlier.
It's all good.
Any statements that, it's kind of like looking at statements that minimize somebody's feelings or the situation or what someone's expressing. Those are the things you should not do.
Yeah, that's good. Right, so validating. Yes. Yeah, if you don't understand, don't try to put yourself in their position. Right. If the person lost a 3-year-old in a car wreck, don't explain to them about how you lost your adult son who's on drugs. Right. Like, that's another thing people do, is they compare and contrast their losses and their griefs with yours, and they're never measurable. Right. It's not from bad intentions. We've all made the mistake of saying something stupid because we love somebody. But you're invalidating their own experience. You're making it about you, really. Right.
And sometimes, from my experience, some of the best things that you can do is allow the person not only to talk about what they are feeling, but to talk about that person.
Oh, yeah.
Talking about the person that's all, I'm not going to say that's all somebody wants to do, but I know for me it was a huge thing that just because he was no longer present on earth didn't mean everything I knew about him and everything I felt had stopped. So
people are so uncomfortable with that, though.
Yes, they are. Allowing people to talk about it and just sitting with them.
Oh, yeah.
You don't have to say anything. Asking them, and in the beginning, often people do not know and they can't tell you what they need.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when you can do things like just look around and think about your own life and what you would need.
That's such such good advice.
Sometimes it's like, okay, don't say, can I go to the grocery store for you? You just say, I'm going to go get some things at the grocery store for you.
Yeah.
Let me do your laundry. Let me pick the kids up from school. Just little bitty things that were normal, everyday things before, but now those things become like these big, huge things they have to tackle.
Oh, yeah.
Because grief causes, whether it's traumatic or not traumatic, your brain goes into that defensive fight or flight thing, and that's all you can think about.
Yeah, it's like loss. You talked about with the cleaning, or it's so hard for us to know what we need in the moment because we're in shock a lot of times.
Mm-hmm.
And for people out there trying to help people in this situation, remember that people don't know what they need. So do something. But then if you try to do something and they don't like it, don't be butthurt about it.
Absolutely.
Don't be offended that you went and got groceries and then they're like, well, hey, my kids actually don't eat any of this.
Mm-hmm.
So could you go back and get this?
Right.
Yeah, that's inconvenient.
Mm-hmm.
But I think people have to go into helping people grieving with really the perspective of, I will do whatever you need.
Right.
You might not know what that is, and I will try the best.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the worst. And I've done this so many times. But it's like you tell somebody, well, let me know if you need something.
Right.
That's the worst. And I've said it, but it's like,
we do it with the best intentions.
Absolutely.
But what I have found, and not so much with myself, but with clients, they'll tell me, I don't want to ask people.
Oh, yeah.
I don't want to be a burden.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to bother anyone. And so I try to work with them to say, okay, let's make a list of what you need and who is asking you, what can I do?
Oh, yeah.
And give them some specifics. But generally you can't do that in the first 2-3 weeks, sometimes even a month. Sometimes it's a little further down the line is when you can say, let's look at what you do need help with.
And that's such a great point, Brandi, because that's another thing. Like, people show up really hardcore the first week.
Yes. And then they're gone.
Yeah, and it's like a year later, you're still dealing with the grief, and those people are on with their life, moving on, doing their own thing.
And I think that's another area that makes it challenging is kind of the concept we've put out into the world over time is you should be over it.
Yeah, you got 2 weeks and you had to be back at work.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's insane.
And, that was just my situation. There was no money. And I had to support myself.
Yeah. But it's an insane concept that, as employers, as systems, that we don't have a system set up to take care of people when they're grieving.
Right.
Especially when it's specifically tragic and, random.
And,
like paternity leave or maternity leave, it's like those things are garbage in America, and paternity leave is not even a thing, barely. But it's like even 10, 12 weeks is not nearly enough for a mom to go through what she has to go through. So it's crazy because these systems are just so broken in which we forget what, we're just so about products and production and making money. And
yes.
And everybody's, losing. And it's like, we all know that people die and that we need help and that all of us know it doesn't take 2 weeks to get over.
Right.
And yet the big umbrella opinion is just get over it. People die.
Right.
You need to move on. You got to get back to work. You got to do life.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And sadly, if you have moved on in certain ways in a short amount of time, then that's unhealthy too.
Oh man, yeah. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, just
extrapolate that?
Maybe when it comes to if someone does lose a spouse and in 3 or 4 months they're already dating, 6 months they're married again. You really have not dealt with anything that you're feeling. You've just brought another person in to kind of, I guess, dull or take the place of that feeling of being alone and empty and
Yeah. Maybe.
maybe
That's the hard part.
And sometimes it doesn't work out and it's terrible.
Yeah, and sometimes it works out really well, and it's insane when people do it. I mean, I think you're talking about a risk factor, right? So when you talk in generalities, like no one should do that, it's hard. And I'm not saying you're saying that.
Right.
What I'm saying is we see enough people and know enough people that somebody passes and getting in a new relationship, whether that's a divorce, whether that's any loss, any change in relationship, quickly is always more risky. Now, there are people who that works out for, and God works that out in their lives, and it works out. But for the majority of people, right, if they haven't been in therapy, if they haven't been working on their stuff, if they haven't really processed out what's going on,
Right.
it raises your risk factor of that not going well really high.
Right.
Yeah, because it's, the outliers that are out there that are like, well, I got remarried in 6 months and it just happened and God put this person in my life. And sometimes that's true. But
yes,
that's not the norm.
I agree with that. Yes. But yeah, when you come from a place of brokenness like that, and because you don't know how to deal with it or you don't want to deal with it, you make decisions based on that. There's consequences to everything we do.
Absolutely. And that's so hard because the other part of that is like the people on the outside looking at you as the grief-stricken person judging what you do.
Yes, that too.
So there's the other problem is like, it's like, when do you date somebody? When do you get remarried? When do you move past this? And for some people, it's going to be too soon. And for some people, it's going to be too long. And the most important thing is you figuring out with a professional what's best for you.
Right.
If your therapist who you've been meeting with for months and who knows you and who's walked through this grief every week is like, okay, this makes sense and this seems like a good thing. And, tell me why this is pros and cons and let's work through the issues. And if you have a good therapist, they're doing that, then yeah, it makes more sense.
Right.
But if you're just winging it and you're all by yourself and you have nobody from external looking in and going, hey, let's monitor this. Are you sure this is not about this? It's going to be bad. Right. And it is bad.
Right. And it's not just with moving on with relationships. It's any big decisions. Like, I would err on the side of don't make any large decisions unless it's absolutely necessary due to finances or,
a crisis.
Yeah. For at least a year.
Yeah.
Just because you're not in a stable emotional place.
No.
When those things happen. So, sometimes you're in the position where maybe you do have to sell a home or you have to take your kids and move to another state because you're alone and you can't care for them. And those are circumstances that can't be avoided, but just to make big decisions because you're uncomfortable can, a lot of times it backfires and creates more problems.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it's hard. I've seen people, but then you have people who, like you said, they have to get out of that situation because they can't live in the house.
Right.
Or they can't live in the city.
And that does happen.
I know for my sister, it was like they were living here in Shreveport, and everywhere she went was somewhere they went. And it's like she just couldn't tolerate it.
Yeah.
We kept talking about that, and she's like, "Oh, we went here and ate. We went here and ate. We went to church here. We were in this community." And everybody else. I think that's the other thing about grief is everybody else just moves on.
Yes.
Their life doesn't, quote unquote, stop.
Well, and the person that's grieving's life doesn't stop. But in their brain, it's like you start moving in slow motion.
Oh, yeah.
And everything is a fog. And, I tell you, I look back on the first year. I don't know what I did. And I went to work every day, and I counseled people all day long every day. And I was a supervisor, and I don't know what I did.
Yeah.
Like, honestly, and that's where, when it comes to kind of talking about God and the spiritual aspect, I 100% know He carried me through that because I don't remember days driving to and from work. I don't remember, I had to be medicated to sleep, that's a big thing that happens with loss and grief is, your whole world's been turned upside down and you don't sleep, but you're exhausted. You don't eat. Sometimes people eat more in the beginning. Sometimes people don't eat at all and lose a lot of weight and then start eating, like a comfort food type thing, or trying to fill the void.
Yeah. Sometimes people drink a lot more,
absolutely.
do drugs, check out. I mean, people do a lot to cope to avoid that pain.
Absolutely. They do. And just kind of on that line of thinking, there are a lot of healthy things you can do to kind of help you walk through grief and process grief. And of course, talking about it is one way.
Why do you think talking about it is so difficult? Like we'll get into, I know we want to get into like what to do about stuff, and we promise we'll give you some answers. But, why do you think talking about death and dying is so taboo?
I think for a lot of people, it's because they're unsure of what happens when they die. And unless they go on that journey, whether you're a Christian or you ascribe to another type of faith, you have to go on that journey to determine for yourself what you believe is going to happen when you pass away or die. And if you have not done that, then it's very scary.
Yeah, it is.
And not only that, but people fear the suffering that comes with dying. The sickness and the things that you have to watch and go through, that a lot of people do have to watch and go through. And so I think it's that you have to specifically search that out and try to come to terms with it, your own terms, and that can be different for everybody, because it's inevitable. If you're born, you're going to die.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, you're born dying. I mean,
absolutely,
it's a downhill slide from the beginning.
Yes,
and I think that you're right. I mean, people don't want to talk about it. It's normal. It's a human condition to avoid pain and avoid the worst things. And I think also we don't talk about it with our kids. We don't talk about it with our families. Families have these family rules where no one talks about it, or they gloss over it. They make it a thing.
In my experience, so 2 of my grandparents died, and James died, and I 100% knew what he wanted, and that's just because we had the conversation, which, strangely enough, and this is a little bit of a sidebar, he believed he was going to die before he was 50. He believed it from the time he was a little boy. And we had many arguments, because I'd be like, stop talking about dying. Well, he fell dead from exactly what he said he was going to fall dead from, but at 41. So,
gosh.
But he had very specifically for years told me what he wanted. And I finally, towards the last couple of years, started listening. And so, not that it wasn't difficult, but I knew exactly what to do for him. My grandparents, who were in their 80s, refused to speak about it. And their deaths, although because they were older, were more natural for me and my brother, they were traumatic for my mother. My grandmother's funeral, she couldn't figure out anything to do, and so we had to step in and try to figure out things that we didn't know either.
Yeah.
And so you're kind of propelled into these positions to figure out how to honorably lay someone to rest and say goodbye to them when you're in like the most pain.
Yeah, I mean, that's so deep, because it means that you're trying to, and I'm just thinking about this right now, but it means that you're trying to make meaning in crisis.
Yes.
Like, and me and you talked about this, and we can get into like how to address that, but it's like, lots of people don't talk about it. They assume that everybody has the same belief or the same understanding about it as everybody else, and then you get to this moment and you have to make these huge decisions, and you don't even know what you believe about death.
Right.
You don't know what you believe about afterlife. You don't know what you believe about like your time with them now. I mean, I think that's another thing, is like when people die, you're all of a sudden rehearsing and going back through all the things you should have said and, didn't say and wish you would have done, while also trying to decide, like, how do I find closure? How do I do this event, right? A funeral,
right.
Which is just, we can get into the insanity of all that. But, how do I make meaning out of this thing? Do I do this song? Do I have this pastor? Do I do this sermon?
Right.
Do I do an open casket? You know, and it's like
Yeah.
everybody's got 40 different opinions about that, and making it very personal to them.
And
the person who's gone, I mean, if they
Right.
didn't say anything,
right.
they don't care.
Right. Well, and and kind of speaking on that, they don't know what you're going to do or what's going to
Yeah.
happen, but your heart wants to honor them
Yeah.
and wants to show all the love you had for them and that they had for people, and it's very overwhelming to figure that out. And sometimes you have 3 days to do it.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Sometimes you get a week, depending on what's happening.
But like you said, while you can't eat, while you
Right.
can't sleep, while
Right.
you're dealing with, work and finances and cleaning up, while you can't go home and clean your office or your room or whatever else it is.
Right.
Yeah. Whew.
And so it's very challenging, and and all of those things do bring a certain amount of, it makes us feel like we're saying goodbye and letting go, but there's no real closure
Yeah.
to death. And because the pain doesn't ever end. Over time it can get different. It may become less intense, but you never stop missing that person or caring about them,
Or thinking about them.
or thinking about them.
There's so
And-
many times my grandmother, who I was really close to, that things happen with my boys or things happen. And she used to love to get, newspaper clippings of everything, all my sports stuff. And if I have an article somewhere or I spoke somewhere, there's so many times that I think, oh, I need to cut this. There's just a moment where I'm like, I need to cut this out and send it to her. And I'm like, oh, wow, that's so crazy. And that's been, I don't even know how long, a long time.
Absolutely.
3, 4 years, 5 years, and then my grandfather's the same way. It's like, there's that, you've probably seen it before, but there's the artist rendition, and it's like, it's this box with the ball in the middle. Have you seen that? So there's a box, and there's a big ball in the middle that fills the whole box up, and there's a button. And it says, grief is a lot like this. And, when it first happens, the ball is bouncing around in the box and it's just barely moving, and it keeps hitting the button. Everything hits the button, hits the button, hits the button. Well, over time, if you do the work, the ball gets smaller within the box, but it's still every now and then more and more hits the button. The button doesn't change. The grief doesn't change. The pain doesn't change. The ball just gets smaller.
Yeah.
And and the more work you do, the smaller the ball gets, but it can randomly hit the button anytime.
Absolutely.
And it feels the same as it did day 1 or day 2 or day 3. And that's just been so helpful to me, because there are times where something hits me with my brother or my grandparents, and I'm like, oh, like I wish that they could meet the boys, or I wish that they were still here for this. And you just feel this well of like grief, and it's like the day after.
Right.
And I think people think you just move past that, and at some point you don't have that pain, or it's wrong if you do.
Right. Right.
And it's like, no, that's actually how it works.
Right. And yeah, I think there's actually a lot of shunning and shaming
Yeah.
for that. If you bring it up and it's been 2-3 years, I mean, I have some clients that they go through that, and it's like people are saying, "Why are you talking about that? Why are you bringing up? You shouldn't be in pain anymore."
Yeah, yeah.
It's like, well, I am.
Right, but that's the same. I mean, golly, how many clients have you said, oh, I don't need to talk about that thing with my dad because I'm way past that. And it's like, well, you actually never dealt with it.
Right.
You never actually felt it.
Right.
And that's the other thing about grief, is you have to grieve.
You do.
Just because somebody dies doesn't mean you're actually. I mean, you might be
Right.
going through the grieving process.
Right.
So let's talk about that. What are talk about the stages of grief, and kind of what does that process look like for those that are. I mean, I think a lot of people have heard it, but let's make it make sense.
So when we talk about the stages of grief, which those stages, and this is just from my experience and my learning,
Yeah.
apply more to someone that's approaching death, not people that are going through grief.
That's good.
So you may experience some of the 5 stages, which the 5 stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And you may, as someone grieving, you may go through each one of those, but you're going to go through a whole lot more than that. So in the initial phases, even when it's something you're waiting on, kind of preparing, like my grandmother, we took her off the machines, we sat on the bedside and just waited for her to take her last breath. There's still a shock in that, in watching someone breathe their last breath. You know, when it's a sudden death, the shock is a little deeper and lasts maybe a little longer. And then you move into, it could be anger, it could be sadness. And I didn't bring it, but there's a book that I have that has a list, and there's pages of emotions, and every single one of them apply, and you could be feeling 15 of them at one time.
Absolutely.
And, you know, irritability.
It's not linear. Right.
There's a lot of disorganization. There's a lot of foggy brain. And when I say foggy brain, just like you can't make decisions because nothing matters. Nothing makes sense, but you know you need to do something. So it's a lot of confusion in your brain sometimes. A lot of being overwhelmed. And you know, you do want to move to the point of acceptance. And what is meant by acceptance isn't saying, oh, I'm
fine with it.
It's being able to know you are adjusting to your new normal.
Yeah.
And we may not like the fact that we're in a new normal, but if you don't begin adjusting to it, then you get stuck.
Absolutely. And I would say that, you know, the stages of grief are helpful for clinicians.
Sure.
What I mean is that if you're a person and you're grieving, you don't know what stage you're in.
Right.
Like you need another external person to be like, hey, this is where you're at. You're really pissed off and you're really angry and you're lashing out. And that's okay. And this is going to be a season, but let's be productive with that. You know, let's be mad about it. It is unfair. It is ridiculous. People are the worst.
Right.
You know, like whatever it is that you need validation in saying. And then that's what we talked about. People, and you know, every podcast that we've had, I probably talk about this, but like, just like trauma responses, just like trauma care, just like taking care of people, it's a brain issue. Like when people are crying and grieving, they're in their right brain. They're way over here in fantasy land and emotions.
Right.
And when you come in and try to fix it, you're talking to this left brain that's shut off and they're not learning or listening. But if you can sit with them and put your arm around them or just sit beside them or just be in the room, you're validating their pain. You're allowing them to grieve. I can't remember if it's Walter Sorr for Lament for a Son. It was one of the best books on grief I've ever read. I can't remember the exact story now. It's been years, but I think he had a son who died in a hiking accident, and he writes his journal, and then Lament for a Son is the little small book that kind of takes him through the stages and the feelings and the experiences. And those personal stories are so helpful because it's better than the stages.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like,
well, because you can relate and connect to, even if you didn't feel the exact thing, you can relate to what they're expressing and what they're saying.
That's why I appreciate you know, being vulnerable today with your story. Is, you know, it's going to be helpful for people because they are going through those things, and there is all these feelings, and it's not as simple as being like, well, you're in anger, and you're in, now we're going to move into denial, and, you know, or move into acceptance or whatever it is. You know?
Right. And I will say, like, when after James's funeral and I went out of town, I set up counseling for as soon as I got back. I knew myself well enough to know that I had to do that. And nothing against any of the people around me, and everyone did great things for me. I knew I wasn't going to talk to anybody the way I needed to except a counselor. Yeah,
because you have to worry about their opinions. You have to worry about taking care of them. You have to worry about what they feel or what they're going to think or how they're going to judge. But being able to go to a non-biased person who you're paying to help you, you can say it however you need to say it just to get it out. And then they get to kind of, you know, it's like taking this backpack in here and just dumping everything out of it. And then you get to kind of pick things up and go, okay, what's this? How do I look at this? What do we need to keep? What do we need to leave? You know, and we can't manage that on our own.
Right.
But I think one of the problems is we've normalized, like, death is not normal. And what I mean by it, it happens a lot. But God didn't intend for it to happen.
Absolutely.
And so from a Christian perspective, it would be like the feeling that you have that this was not supposed to happen
is correct.
You know, and one of the things with Dustin that was so impactful for me to learn, it's painful but impactful, is that I, knowing that he was going to die, I took all this time to hug him and love him and to tell him I loved him. And every interaction I had with him was like, okay, I need to make this count. I need to make this time count. Oh, he's over at my house. I'm watching him and taking up, make this time, make meaning. And when he died, it wasn't enough. And what it pointed me to was that it's not supposed to be. That no matter what we do in this life, we can do the best we can. We can be present as much as we can. We can tell our loved ones as much as we want, but there's going to be a feeling of it not being enough, because there is an after.
Right.
That this is not over. That we will have eternity together with this person, and then it will be resolved. And I think the world and people want it to be enough. They're justifying, well, you got time with him and you did this and he loved you and they loved you, and so it should be okay. It should be enough and you should move on. Or if you go to the other side, it's like it has no meaning anyway, and nihilistic. I guess you can go all the way that way and be really, really tough on yourself. But I think people have to understand that feeling of loss is going to be with them forever.
Speaking of loss, when it comes to grieving a person, or even grieving after divorce, or the loss of a long-term relationship, you go through what's called secondary losses. And those are all of the things that, like, you will grieve that you're no longer a wife or a husband, or grieving if you didn't have children, if you grieving different things that you will encounter, especially with kids. Every milestone, there's a grief that comes from the fact that person that you're supposed to share this with is no longer present, and you're doing it alone. And all of those things are things that you have to process and face, or your life just doesn't get better and you stay stuck.
That's good. I mean, it's a good thing to remember, is that, it's not just the loss of the person, but all the things around it.
Right. And, and those are things that'll come up and surprise you, that you won't be like, we expect holidays and anniversaries and birth dates. We know that those are going to be difficult days, just because those were days that we gave special attention to. But there are other things that come up that, the first time you go to a get-together and everybody's there except that your person.
Yeah, when you're the single person again.
Right, and just different things like that.
And I've heard some clients say, it's really annoying when people call you on Christmas because it's hard, and they didn't call you on the 15 days before that, because for you, it's really not that different. It's like, it's not any worse today than it was yesterday for you. Does that make sense?
It does.
It's like, tomorrow's the 26th. He's still not going to be here. She's still not going to be here.
And often, like, when Christmas is coming up, Christmas isn't as, just like you're saying, Christmas isn't as upsetting as the anticipation of Christmas.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
No, it does. I've heard it 100 times. It's like, so again, for people out there who are helping people through grief, remember that, you need to check in with them ahead of time, right? Not just during, but the aftercare, the weekend check-ins like Jenna did, like those little things matter so much more. I mean, or as much as, the meal train. And meal trains, I love them. But my goodness, it's not as helpful as people think it is.
And I had a friend that
I don't like this.
Did a great thing for me that I have begun doing for other people, is she bought me gift cards for food.
Oh yeah, that's so good.
I think there was like 10 of them.
And you can send somebody else to use that gift card and get you food, but at least you're getting what you want.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and because for me, I didn't eat for like 4 months. I lost a ton of weight, and then I started eating, and whole nother story. But I didn't cook anymore. It was a year before I went in the kitchen. If if it wasn't a planned thing and people were coming over, I did not go in my kitchen. And so, that turned out to be a great thing for me that I in turn have done for other people, because even though, again, it's well-intentioned and it can be helpful, especially when you have kids, to have meals coming, but a lot of that goes to waste.
Absolutely.
I mean, I hate to say that, but
Oh no, yeah,
because
you
you're
throw
not going
out
to
so
eat.
much food.
You don't want to eat.
Yep.
So another thing that I do for people, because I lived on goldfish crackers and peanut butter crackers for like months, and so I make little baskets of snacky things.
Yeah.
Because that may be all I ate in one day was, a pack of peanut butter crackers.
Right.
And it was all I could do to do that.
I'm sure.
So, just providing people with
Multiple avenues of things.
Yes.
Yeah. I think we get so, stuck with the things that we've always done or we've always seen done. And usually, like people who are going through grief, we don't want to be unappreciative. So nobody's like, well, this isn't helpful.
Right. And it's not that it's not helpful. And it does mean something to you.
Absolutely.
It does. It's just you can't do anything about the condition of your body at that time.
Yeah. And I think people need to learn to tolerate when a person comes to you and says, I know you intended this well. I know you put a lot of effort into it, and I appreciate that. It also didn't help. That people have to be able to tolerate that and hold that and not take that personally and be offended and not say, well, you should appreciate it because I did the best I could and I took my time, blah, 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 blah.
You're right. And again, that goes back to, asking what people need and being able to say, this is what I need.
Yeah, exactly. And for people who are going through, again, I think we're talking about like a healthy individual who knows what they want, knows what they need.
Right.
Most of us aren't, and we don't know what to expect, and we don't know the things that are going to hit us. And
that whole concept, I think, is something that's difficult in our culture. Is we learn you don't ask for help. You have to do it on your own.
Pull yourself up by your
And
bootstraps.
so when someone comes at you saying you need to figure out what you need and tell people, it's like, no, I can't tell people what I need.
Oh, yeah.
Well, but you're not going to get the support you need unless you do, because they don't know what to do, but they are offering. They
Right.
want to.
So there's that's part of this podcast is twofold. One, to teach people grieving how to, what's going on, but also to remind people like there are things to do. You don't have to just do a meal train. You can do other things. We had a friend. We had a lot of support with Dustin. And speaking of asking for help, I was the worst. I'm a 2 on the Enneagram, and so I'm like, I want to help everybody else. We're like this as therapists, and it's like I'm not used to letting people help me, and people help me in the past. I had to pay for it, so it's like, oh, you helped me, but now I'm going to have to listen to that for the next year of my life, or be forever indebted to you. So I was just really bad at that. But with Dustin, everything was so difficult that the B group, the Sunday school we were in, like they were super helpful. They came over and prayed over the house, over him. They brought us meals. One of my friends, Tyler and Amy, I remember they dropped us off like when we were going through some things with our kid. They dropped us off in $100 gift card, and those things are super helpful.
They are,
but they don't take away your pain. They don't necessarily move you through the process any faster, or faster than what the people would like it to be.
Yeah.
And so, on both ends, as a person grieving, you have to realize lots of times people are doing the best they can with what they have.
Yes.
You need to learn to be better at asking for what you need. And then the people who are trying to help, have to be more specific and, focused on how to help and not just throw things at the wall and see what sticks.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Because I think both of those are why we are, in the situation we are with people not knowing how to grieve and process.
Right.
Which then, unfortunately, does make them in the grief, because there is a bad version, right? There is the unresolved grief where people don't want to move on.
Right.
Where people are still doing the same things they've been doing.
And that could be because they've avoided or because what you just said. They don't want to accept that person is gone, and so they refuse to adapt to a new reality, and then those people do become depressed and isolative, and their life is not a happy one, for sure.
Yeah, it's a balance, and I think you can't find that balance without community, without other people checking in on you and going, hey, you haven't changed clothes in 4 days.
Right.
I'm going to go turn the shower on. I'm going to watch the kids. You go take a shower. You know, little things like that, because that happens.
Right.
You know, it's like, hey, you know, there's 5 empty bottles of wine. Let's put these up. Let's get you some water.
Right.
Not judgmental, not critical,
No,
but just
right.
like, well, I'm going to help you walk through this together. And, you know, it's uncomfortable.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You know.
And a lot of things that you need to do to process grief can be uncomfortable.
Yeah, let's talk about that. So what are some ways if people are grieving and they feel like, man, they're not really moving past it and they're not really dealing with it, and not moving past it, but
just moving in it and processing that feeling, whatever feelings are coming up. Journaling is a great way. And I just grabbed a few journals that I have that are specific to grief, and there's all kinds of them out there. So whether you've lost a spouse, whether you've lost a child, a parent, they have journals, grief journals specifically tailored to walk you through the loss of that person. And it's full of questions where you don't have to necessarily come up with what you're going to write about.
Read one of those.
Let's see. This one was write the person who passed away a letter of things you wish you had told them. Or is there a favorite clothing item of theirs that has sentimental meaning to you? And it just makes you go through things that
that if you don't talk about or ask about, like they're going to get lost in the
right.
Yeah, I have this little, I mean, if you're listening, you can't see it, but there's a black car up there, and then there's this little cannon that are up there, and those are my grandfather's. And when he passed away, like, the black car has cologne in it, and if I open it, it still smells, I mean, it has the cologne still. And, you know, every once in a while I'll open it and just smell it. And it's like, whoa, like, all the feelings and memories and all that kind of stuff come so far back.
So I made a list.
Oh.
Sorry.
No, you're good.
Not that we have to go through all of these, but all of these are things that you can do, and all of these are things that I did.
Yeah.
But so outside of talking and writing, if you're a creative, artsy person, or even if you're not, trying to use art in a way to process grief, where you either paint it with paintbrushes, like how you're feeling, like just letting emotion run through you and trying to connect that with something artistic.
And I want to run through this real quick before we go through the list, because I think it's important, because you mentioned it, but then we plan on talking about it. But for people listening, maybe you don't have somebody who's died, right? But maybe, like you said, those secondary things, and not even secondary, like primary grief. Like, I remember after Hurricane Katrina coming back out of the Superdome, you know, one of the things that I did and have done several times in really, really stressful times is written poems.
Yes.
You know, and that was about my loss of what I thought the world was like. And, you know, so just if you're out there listening, you know, grief is not just about death. It's about these stages that we've talked about. So as we go through this list, they're going to apply to those things too.
Sure. Absolutely. So with the art factor, I know one thing I did was I created a big collage. I got a big painting or canvas, and I finger painted. And I hadn't finger painted since I was a kid, but like, I got the paint and just smeared it in the way that I was feeling. And so it's a big globby mess. This particular collage is not an art piece that anybody would think, oh, that's really pretty. It's not pretty. And I used colors that represented each person, and then like used the dark black and mixed it all in. But then I went and found objects that represented feelings, like broken glass and empty cups, and or that had a hole in the middle. Like, those are the two that pop in my head. And there's something about putting an object with a feeling, or can express it different than language does.
Yeah, it makes it concrete.
Yes.
Yeah.
Using music, where you
Oh man, music will make you cry for sure.
write songs, or you pick songs that speak to what you're feeling, and you sit with it, and you listen to it, and you allow yourself to feel it. Writing letters to the person. Again, that's what the journal thing was, but in expressing things that you didn't get to say or that you want to say again.
Yeah, you were talking about that before the podcast. We were saying you writing some of this stuff down made you cry. Yeah, it's that right brain functioning, right? When you do art, when you do music, it's all getting into your emotions. And we're so quick in America, especially, to go to logic and make it make sense.
Right.
Yeah, that's good.
You can take those letters and read them at grave sites.
Yeah.
Balloon releases. Planting trees in someone's honor where every time you look at it, that's a representation of them in some way. I know I specifically used shirts and made pillows, and then I took the scraps and made Christmas ornaments, and I took handwriting and made rings. I mean,
You did a lot.
I did a lot.
It's good.
I created a lot of objects out of the person's belongings.
Yeah.
Quilt, a blanket of shirts. There's a lot of things you can do with people's belongings. Etsy and Pinterest have tons and tons of ideas, and I went with every one of them. The first year, that's all I did. I spent every penny I had on doing grief-related things, making a memory box and putting special things in it, having birthday parties for them after they're gone, in remembrance. You know, some people it's at holidays, setting a place for them. Like, just because they're gone doesn't mean you have to, never speak about them or never allow them and their memory to be part of things. Now, again, that can be difficult for some people to do. It might be more painful for them than helpful, but if it's helpful,
well, I think that's a great point, is that as people listen to the list, some people are going to not want to touch any of this stuff, and not for an unhealthy reason. It's just not how they are. I'm not a graveside person. That's just not my personality.
Right.
I'll go, when I go home, and my mom probably listens to this, but when I go home with my mom, or if we're there or whatever, they'll want to go out, and everybody in DeVille is, plotted, they're going to have their family. They already got our plots probably. And it's here's where you're going to be buried, and here's where Papa's buried, and we're going to go out and visit, and we're going to go out to these things. And I'm not saying that's good or bad. It just doesn't do it for me.
Right.
And not
Absolutely.
negatively. I'm not avoiding it. For me, that doesn't impact. I don't cry when I'm standing out there. But for my mom, maybe they're put stuff out there. They go visit them. They talk to them. They pray to them. Or not pray to them, but pray with them. Whatever. And I'm just none of that makes sense to me.
Right.
And I don't judge them for it.
No.
But I think that's the most important thing, is you have to be congruent with who you are, and you have to figure out: am I avoiding, or am I overdoing it? And you can't look at somebody else and go, well, Brandi, for somebody listening going, oh my gosh, Brandi did all these incredible things and I haven't done any.
Right.
Well, check with yourself, and maybe you do need to do some of them, but you also might not need to do all of them. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Because I think that's the other thing, is one size fits all is what gets us in trouble. And then, it's just the way you have to do it.
Right. And I'll speak to that in the fact that I created a whole room, and I did so much that after about a year and a half, I started looking around my house, and all it was stuff of dead people. And not just James, and so
Yeah, memoriam.
I started thinking, this isn't healthy. This is everywhere I look is a picture of someone who is no longer alive.
Yeah.
So I scaled it back, and it's all in one closet.
Nice.
And I have to specifically go and open that closet if I want to. But my entire house had turned into a shrine, and I was like, this okay.
Well, yeah, but
So,
you have to do it. That's
Right.
the other thing, is you don't have to do grief perfectly. You walk through it, and you do the best you can, and sometimes you have to check yourself and go, okay, this is too much.
Right.
This is a little farther than what I want to go, but it had its purpose at the time.
Right. Oh yeah. When I was doing it all, that's all I could do. And that's how. Really,
you survived.
Yes, that's how I survived.
Yeah.
And
it's what you needed for that day at that time. And all of a sudden, because you're doing the work, it's not what you need anymore.
Absolutely.
You
Right.
know, and then you have to shift that.
Right.
And I think that's hard for people too, is, when they've been grieving a certain way for so long, giving that up.
Right. Or feeling like, if I'm not this sad all the time, then that must mean I don't miss them, or I don't love them, or I don't
That's a
care
big
about
one.
them. And that's so not true.
That's such a big one.
And the majority of people that have passed on, their wish is not for you to sit and be sad for them. They want you to live your life,
Yeah.
and to experience things, and even to, have new love. And you have to get to the place where you can be ready for that. But I think it is to some degree, it's a natural process to have some guilt when you move forward. But if you stay in that, that's not healthy.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, JC and I talk about it all the time. Like, would you remarry if I died tomorrow, and what would that look like? And I think those are important conversations to have, but we want to avoid them a lot of times and never talk to them, talk about them, because of the pain and the awkwardness of it.
Right.
And I'm like, no, you can't ever marry. No, I'm just kidding. Like, I don't know what I think about it. We're still kind of in the middle of talking about it. And I'm like, well, I trust that as long as you're prayerful, and as long as you use your community, as long as you go to therapy, as long as you take your time with it, that God's going to do what he's going to do for whatever's best for you.
Right.
But I don't know what that is. And I don't know what's best for me. And I don't know, I definitely can't measure that to our best friends. You can't say what's going to happen. But keep going with I know you got more stuff on the list, because
I think I mentioned most of them.
Okay, good. Yes, and people can figure out new things, right? I mean, people can get on there online and Google.
Right. I mean, and these are just the ones that, as I was thinking about this, that were helpful. Planning, doing activities that they enjoyed. Like, you don't have to stop doing everything just because that person's not there. Or if there's, a time when you just want to kind of be in their memory for a day. Go and do the things that they loved. Take people with you to do them. Like, that's another way of processing, is just continuing to live and enjoy what they enjoyed.
Yeah. I think you can't be embarrassed about how you grieve either, If you're a spouse, and it all depends. If you're a husband and wife and you lose a kid, or if you're a single person, a married person, you lose a spouse, like, being honest with the other people who are close, who are still living, about what you need and how you need to grieve is important, and to not judge the other people for what they're doing, to be a learner, to say, tell me why that's helpful for you. You go out to the graveside and you sit and you read for hours.
Right.
Why is that helpful?
Right.
Like, is that helpful? Not already have an assumption that that's probably not good and it's unhealthy, but kind of figure it out together, because it's a process.
Right.
And although you can eventually over grieve, like more than not, you probably need to lean that direction than under, in my opinion.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think it comes down to, again, you knowing yourself, and knowing, like, when you need to do something to process, and when you need to sit in it alone, or when you just need to let it flow through and go, if that makes sense.
No, it does. So on that, since we got a little bit of time left, me and you've been talking about some stuff we want to do with the practice, and changing some things. So how can we, and people in their area, professionals who are listening to this in their area, we're planning some things, for 2021, 2022 on helping with this, because I think one of the things we talked about a couple weeks ago was no one's planning, and no one even knows the context to talk about these things. So like I said, me and my wife talking about what you're going to do, like, we need to get our will in order. We need to know where our kids are going to go if we get in a car wreck.
Right.
The statistics are very clear. Very few people are doing that.
Absolutely.
And like you said, that causes so much headache and heartache, and angst and depression and PTSD for everybody left behind.
Right.
So tell me a little bit about, what we talked about, pretend like I don't know, for those listening, and kind of what we're going to do and what we think would be helpful.
So, for lack of a better term, I right now I'm just calling it end of life planning. And for me, that doesn't mean the part where you go and get your burial plot and pay for that. I'm thinking more of, like, helping people prepare and actually plan their funerals, who they want the minister to be, if that person's available, or how they want someone to choose a minister, the songs, the flowers, what they want to represent them. Even ideas on, like, for each person that passed away over the last couple of years, every person's funeral was different. We did it all different ways, creatively. So what your creative approach is, writing obituaries before you die, like rough copies. Of course, there's always got to be tweaks and changes, but if there's a good outline to follow, and even having some things prepared, having pictures in a place ready, things to make those, the things they put up and view that I don't know the yes, there you go. To do those things.
Which, man, those things always get everybody.
But it's very hard when you're in those moments. You've got to pull out all the pictures albums and all the things.
Yeah, and you have 3 days to a week to do it.
And you're searching for all the, the pictures that are going to best represent that person's life, and then you have to put it together in whatever way you put it together. And so, I mean, my goal and what I want to help people with is planning that before, hopefully long before it ever comes.
Yeah.
But even if you're in stages of, maybe you have terminal cancer or some kind of illness.
Or, you have an illness that you're not going to live past 50 or,
Right. Just being prepared. And not only does that help the people that are going to be grieving when you pass away, it's going to give you peace of mind that my family knows exactly what I want and what to do, and it's going to ease their suffering a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Well, because it's a guarantee, that we're going to die.
Absolutely.
As we're talking about it, and I'm like, oh, that's a lot, and it's like, but it's going to happen.
Right.
So you either don't at all plan for it, or at some point you take the space to do it.
Right. And even like we talked about before, I would like to help people, and I have had clients that I've done this with, is help them on their journey of figuring out, what does it mean to me? Like, what's going to happen to me after I die?
Yeah.
What do I believe? Because if we need to become more comfortable with the fact that that's what is going to happen.
Yeah.
Trying to think. So the end of life planning, funeral preparations, wills, like even before you go and make a will and a living will and DNRs and all of the medical things, maybe helping them figure out, what do I want to leave to who? And how do I want this written? And how do, just helping them talk through all of those things. Because while things are not important and they don't go with somebody when they pass away, if there's not plans and things specific here, some families handle that great and do everything perfectly or well, and some people fight and families are destroyed over people's things.
Yeah, I don't know the whole story because I was little, but my grandfather was passed away when I was 12. And I remember every Christmas, every Thanksgiving, every holiday, we were always over there. And he was always pulling stuff out and like, hey, this is going to be yours. This is your gun. This is your ring. This is your thing. And when he passed away, it was my step-grandmother at the time, from the story that I know, is that none of that got passed down because there wasn't a will. They couldn't find it. And so it was just somewhat of a mess. And I don't know all the details and won't go into it. But I just remember, as a kid being like, well, Papa told me that was going to be mine. And I looked forward to that being a thing I hunted with and used and, that kind of stuff. And that never happened.
Right.
And that's a small scale of, millions of things that people go through. And it's divisive. It breaks people apart. People are ticked off and mad. And I wanted this, and this had meaning for me, and this had meaning for you. And, it's a lot.
Yeah.
And if they don't have it, it'd be really nice if it was planned.
Right.
And talked through. But yeah, and so I think that would be extremely helpful as a culture and as therapists and as a team if we could make that available to churches, make that available to businesses, make that available to anybody who definitely 100% knows it's happening,
Sure.
When there's an illness, but in general, like being incorporated into therapy. And I think what I've seen, and we've talked about before, is we do that anyway. What ends up happening is you're talking to some degree about the end of life and what's going on. But I mean, you're dealing with 100 other things, so it doesn't get the attention it needs.
Right.
But to be able to have a specific thing where somebody's like, I'm really scared of death.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really scared of end of life.
Mm-hmm.
Usually because, if we're being honest, it's like, because this happened with so-and-so, and now I'm thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
If we had an avenue in which they could come and say, I want this specific service therapeutically, man, what a gift to people to be able to do that. You know, like me, if I would have known, like I've been thinking about that with our kids, and I'm like, we don't have all these extended family, but man, I certainly want to leave a will and leave who's going to be in charge of this practice, and because I don't want people fighting over it, like what was happening when I was a kid.
Absolutely.
But I wouldn't know who to go to, because you can go to a lawyer, you know, but they're not going to walk you through the emotional, traumatic, family systems type things that you could.
And to some degree, that if you don't know what you want, they don't know necessarily how to lead you to figuring that out.
Yeah.
I mean, their job is the legality of it,
Yeah.
which is important, especially
Absolutely.
in certain, even if there aren't things to leave, you know, it's still important. Like, and I know the experience in my family is my mother was never adopted, but her father that recently passed raised her, and the way they had to write it a specific way in the will, but you know, and in my brother's case, he was adopted, but it has to be written a certain way in the will, or that person has difficulty with everything they try to do in that person's
forward,
death. Especially trying to, like, close out someone's estate. Like, it brings up all kinds of issues that you wouldn't know were a problem unless you have prepared and planned for these things.
Mm-hmm.
So,
That's good.
I definitely think that is, you know, and the more comfortable you get with speaking about death and planning for it, then kind of the less surprising it is when you begin approaching it. And it's going to bring emotions. You're going to be anxious, and it might mess with your sleep for a few days, you know, after you really sit down and look at these things. But in the long run, you're being proactive and planning for something that
is 100% going to happen.
Yes.
You know, that's what's so crazy about it. I mean, even as we're talking about it right now, my brain's just like, that's like, even me, I'm like wanting to avoid, you know, and it's like, yeah, but this is not like a might happen, right? This isn't like, well, what happens if somebody, you know, loses this job and we have to do this other thing? Well, we won't, so let's not plan for it. Like, this is a thing that's 100% going to happen and have major effects on the family for generations.
Right.
You know?
And one way of looking at it as well is planning how you want your funeral to go, whether it's a burial and all of these things, or a cremation and all of these things, cost you no money except the time to sit down with someone to do it.
Yeah. And I think,
like,
and if they're sitting with you, like, it's so therapeutic because you're making meaning of each one of those things, which actually helps you then focus on the things that are current in your life and make those things that at the end of life are so important. A client was talking this morning, and we were talking about work and figuring out what they're going to do with their kid and a bunch of other stuff. And we were talking about, like, looking at life as like, what would it say on your headstone? And it's kind of the same process. It's like, do you want it to say was a great businessman, you know, or do you want to say great father, great husband, you know, great follower of Christ? And so when you don't plan, you don't realize that you're actually living your life as if what's going to be on your tombstone is like, he was super busy. He made a lot of money. He had nice stuff. He had a huge 401k. And you don't stop to really look at the context of which, like, what are you investing in and what are you spending your time with? But when you have to sit with, let's say somebody comes to you or me or whoever and has to sit and process that, it's like, oh, we're fine tuning what that tombstone's going to look like, what that end of death stuff's going to look like. And when I do die, which I'm going to, whether tomorrow or 40 years from now, these things are going to still be representative of who I am. And no one's going to be surprised.
Right.
Like, they're going to go, oh yeah, that's who Brandi was. That's who Clint was. Like, that's what they focused on. And that's, of course, what they're doing at their funeral, because that's representative of them. Not what did other people think about. I mean, that's important too, but that's not it's not so off, and you're just trying to wing it and figure it out.
Absolutely.
Well, what's anything you want to talk about grief wise that if somebody's listening that you really just want them to understand, and any kind of last thoughts?
I guess the overall thing I would want to say is that to try not to be afraid to sit with the pain and to talk about the person, even if you think someone else is bothered by it. Do it anyway. Mm-hmm. Because most of the time, a lot of times, people aren't bothered and we think they're bothered.
Yeah.
Do what you need to do and find the support network that is going to be able to walk with you in the way you need them to.
That's so
good.
But
definitely to allow yourself to process it.
Yeah.
Don't shut it down. I mean, there are times when, maybe because you're at work, you have to shut it down and do what you have to do, but allow yourself opportunities.
Put a pin in it.
Yeah. Allow yourself opportunities when you're not in your work life or dealing with children, carving out time where you allow the grief to just kind of flow through you, and you cry and you get mad and you punch things, as long as you're not going to hurt yourself, and get a punching bag. Do what you need to do to release some of that, because no matter how you deal with it, if you don't deal with it, it's going to come out in some form.
Absolutely. That's good.
I don't think we touched on that, but your body's going to hold it.
You got time.
And it's going to come out in some way, shape, or form. Whether it shows up in illness, whether it shows up in your body being in pain and hurting, or whether the lack of sleep continues and you never get back on a normal, natural sleep rhythm. It'll come out in the way you deal with other people. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's gonna show itself. Yeah. And so,
it comes out in the way you commit, and the way you are vulnerable, and in the way that you do marriage, and all the things that you did previously. They don't go away.
Right.
That grief integrates, and if you don't process it and make meaning out of it properly, that's what I love about. I know recently, I don't know if you know this, I'm sure you do, but Kubler-Ross, what's the first name? Who did the grief stages?
Elizabeth?
Yeah. Now they've let this other guy come in and make a sixth stage, which is making meaning. Mm-hmm. And I love that, because that's really so true. It's like you have to make meaning out of these things.
Right.
And that's what I keep going back to individually. Like, you have to make your own meaning. Mm-hmm. Your own, what's going to help you move through, what's going to help you process, what's going to make meaning out of who they were and who you are and who God is. Mm-hmm. And then you can find some peace.
Right.
It doesn't mean you're going to alleviate all pain.
Right. And focus and try to remember and focus on the fact that you're the only one walking in your shoes. So if someone doesn't understand what you're doing, that is okay.
And they're not going to.
It is okay.
Yeah.
Do what you need to do for you, as long as you're not doing harmful things to yourself,
Absolutely. I did want to spend just a few minutes on, kind of right now we're in this 2021, we're in like 2020 part 2 or something. And COVID. So one of the things that I saw with COVID that's been, grief related, for those listening, there is a process in which we're all grieving as a world, as Americans, through this pandemic. And I've seen kind of the stages of grief played out, right? Mm-hmm. That when it first came, we were in denial. Mm-hmm. Everybody's like, no, that's just China.
Sure.
It's going to be over there. It's not going to be that big of a deal. And then it came here, and they started canceling things, and, your gyms get shut down, and we got into anger. Mm-hmm. We're like, I was mad. I was like, this is ridiculous. Like, it's 2 people in America have it. Why are we shutting everything down? And then I got into bargaining, where I'm like, okay, well, we'll shut down for 3 weeks. That'll be long enough. We'll be all right. And then we'll be fine. Mm-hmm. I don't know what stage we're all in now, but definitely not acceptance. But it's been a strange season as a world, especially with social media, and especially with the way that we all can see everything constantly in the news sources we get. But I just wanted to remind everybody out there that this is a form of living grief. Like, people are grieving,
sure.
and the loss of their jobs, the loss of their expectations. And when you're in that, I know for me, I have a 6 and a 3-year-old boys, and I used to love thinking about what we're going to do next year or what we're going to do when they're 14. And because we can't do any of the things we used to do, or I have a harder time connecting to those future things.
Sure.
Because I'm like, I have no clue what this is going to look like.
Right.
And so I've heard a lot of people complain about that. Like, well, I just can't find joy right now. I can't hope. I can't have vision. And it's like, well, of course you can't.
Right.
Like, no one's giving us a way out of this. And you don't want to be a doomsday person, but you also, it's hard to muster up the feelings to look to the future. So that's just something, this all contextually falls into that. But I wanted to get your thoughts on kind of
Sure.
what you thought about COVID and how is it affecting us with grief.
I think a lot of people feel trapped because they have limited things that they can do with their lives. Even if they wanted to do certain things, it's just not allowed.
Right.
And so, and you can only stay in 4 walls for so long before that affects everyone's mental state.
Absolutely.
And you could be the most optimistic person on the planet, and those people are being affected.
Yeah.
Because your social networks are smaller. Who you can spend time with regularly is smaller. Where you can go is limited. It's like we've gone back in time.
Oh, for sure.
To a world that we're not used to. We had a lot of freedoms and a lot of endless amounts of things to do, and it's all just been taken away. And so it's figuring, each person has to figure out their own path through that and how to deal with that and how to work with the feelings that creates for them. But it's definitely grief.
Yeah.
The loss of, to some degree, freedom.
Yeah.
The loss of, for a lot lot of people, they haven't seen their parents or, older parents. Like there are some people, like in my family, thankfully, I'm not going to say we don't care, but we're seeing one another, and even if we had COVID, we're going to be in each other's space but there are some people that
choose not to.
Right.
Yeah.
And so there are some parents who haven't seen their grandparents who haven't seen their grandkids or their kids since this began.
Mm-hmm.
I have, my mother has a friend who literally hasn't gone anywhere.
Oh, yeah.
Since this started.
Yeah. And I have some clients who have really, specific illnesses that, haven't seen each other's faces inside the house and, because they're wearing masks in the house and they have to. It's not like even an option. Like to them, it's life or death. And we don't have to get into whether that's true or not true.
Right.
But it's people's experience of this thing that's been so different. And on top of it, I think 2020 was just a lot of things. Whether it's the election or whether it's, political stuff, whatever it is, lots of loss happens. And I have one client who I don't see anymore, but she'll know who she is when I'm talking about it. But, every time we talk about things and we were in therapy, I'd look at her and she's like, "Are you kidding me?" And I'm like, "What?" And she's like, "Is this loss again?" Because it was all back to her childhood that she had never worked through loss in the specific. And so the losses that she was currently experiencing were bringing her all the way back to these unresolved losses. And for her, that was just the thing, whether it was her kids or whether it was working. And so that's what, I want people to remember through this process is that grief and loss they're different. They're the same. It's not just about death. It's about the loss of expectations, the loss of perspective, the loss of what we had. And we're all going through that. And so if we could all just be a little patient with each other, if we could all lean into the uncomfortableness of pain and let people sit in their junk a little bit, if we can all assume that the other person's doing the best they can with what they have and ask them what they need. And then if you're a person out there struggling, find some people who are safe in your life and be a little vulnerable, share what you need and allow them to help you and let it be good enough. It may not be what you 100% need. It may not take away the pain, but let it be good enough and let the community and the connection be something that maybe doesn't fix your wounds, but that, put some salve on there. Mm-hmm. So anyway, any closing comments for you?
It's good to talk about this
Yeah,
and
it's
to
great.
put it out there, and I hope that someone learns something from it, gets something from it, and I hope as I move forward in my practice that I can help more people with this.
Absolutely. Yeah, I look forward to us kind of continuing to do what we do, and hopefully we can get stuff on the website and get some videos and get an actual structure to what we're talking about, and be another great resource for people. And I think you're going to do an amazing thing with people for that at our practice, and it's much needed. So if you're out there and you're listening to this and you're grieving, Brandi Walker, she's an awesome therapist. So she's at Clint Davis Counseling. We have other therapists who work with this. If you need to find a therapist in your area, make sure you reach out and process. We'd love for people to do the preemptive work of talking about this beforehand, before we're in the crisis, before we're in the pain. Sometimes we don't get to do that. And so if you're in the pain, if you're in the middle of grief, it's okay to go and ask for help. It's okay to process with someone. And if you don't have people around you who are being helpful, it's okay to tell them it's not helpful. And they're big boys and girls, and they can learn to filter and differentiate and work on their stuff. So thank y'all for listening. Be sure to subscribe on our YouTube channel, or leave a comment, or give us a star or 5 stars or whatever on iTunes. And so we'd be thankful for that. Have a good day. God bless.